1918, the Great War would come to an end. It had taken 10 million lives and shattered European civilization. The war changed everything. It gave birth to the world we live in now. This picture, taken somewhere on the Western Front, shows an official cameraman setting up his equipment to film the last shots of the war. The armistice had been signed at 5 that morning, but during the 6 hours before 11 o'clock, fighting continued until the last minute. A recording made by artillery's sound-ranging apparatus near the Moselle River shows the moment the war ended and the peace began. After 11 o'clock, there is no gunfire. Just 2 blips caused by a soldier firing off his pistol in celebration. A reporter from The Times could not believe it. It seems incredible to be standing here with all the paraphernalia of war lying about, and the air absolutely still, and the silence unbroken by a single shot.
Strangely enough, we wept because the silence was so awful. See, we'd been used to the noise of guns all day long, all day long, all day long.
Slowly, the news came in officially that an armistice had been signed, but there was no show of emotion. We were too far gone. I mean, say, the perceptions, our emotions were all killed long ago.
I don't think my father found it a glamorous experience at all. People in 1914 had never seen a war. The country itself hadn't taken part in a major war for 99 years, since 1815, and even that war hadn't really impinged upon the population in the way that wars since have. You only have to read Jane Austen to realize that it did not. So no one really knew, except for the professional soldiers, what war was about, and they thought it was going to be a great adventure. It was going to be over by Christmas. They would have an enormous amount of fun. There might be a few people killed, but they would be romantically laid to rest with all the ceremony and so on. There'd be lots of heroes, and they could go back to their wives and girlfriends as heroes, having had a great adventure.
It had been a war like no other. Men had found themselves living in holes like foxes or badgers. There were new and horrible ways to die, by high-explosive shell, machine gun, poison gas, disease, and drowning in mud. Now, at last, it was over. On November the 11th in London, an airship filmed people crossing the Thames on their way to Buckingham Palace, where crowds had been gathering to await the stroke of 11. Big Ben had been silent through the war and was about to strike for the first time in 4 years. King George had been one of the first in Britain to know what time the war was going to end, because he'd been telephoned early that morning by his school friend, the First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Roslin Weems, who had just signed the armistice for Britain in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne.
As everybody knows, the armistice happened at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918, and that was what Weems signed. That wasn't what he'd been told to sign. He'd been told to sign by Lloyd George an armistice which would come into effect at 2:30 p.m. on the 11th of November 1918. And those were his instructions, but he disobeyed his instructions for two reasons. One, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month was poetry. 2:30 p.m. on the 11th of November was not. And also he said, if we fight on for another 3.5 hours, thousands of people may get killed. He then returned to Paris and rang up the king and told him what he'd done. And the king spread the word about as quickly as he could. And so by 11 a.m. there were vast crowds in front of Buckingham Palace, and the king and queen came out onto the balcony and were the heroes of the hour. By 2:30 p.m. Lloyd George was wanting to stand up in the House of Commons and announce the fact and pull his watch out of his pocket, and everybody was meant to have said good on Lloyd George and vote him back into power at the next general election. Nobody was there at all. They were all getting wildly out of control in front of Buckingham Palace. So Lloyd George was very angry indeed, as were other members of the cabinet, and they censured Weems for having done this. They were quite unpleasant to him when he got back to London on the 12th of November. He couldn't believe that they all looked very gruff and glum and unpleasant. He thought that was incredible pettiness. And they also didn't give him a peerage like they gave everybody else who'd been in charge of the services. And they didn't give him £100,000, which they gave to everybody else who'd been at that rank. £100,000 then is about £5 million now. So his determination that thousands of people shouldn't get killed between 11 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. on the 11th of November, and his wish to be poetic about it cost him £5 million.
The royal family had sworn not to touch alcohol for the duration of the war. Now the war was over, the king opened a bottle of brandy laid down at the time of Waterloo. It tasted, said the king, very musty. November the 11th, Buckingham Palace. Today has indeed been a wonderful day, the greatest in the history of this country, wrote the king in his diary. He also said what he now felt about his cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm. How are the mighty fallen? He had been emperor just over 30 years. He did great things for his country, but his ambition was so great that he wished to dominate the world, and he created his military machine for that object. No man can dominate the world. It has been tried before, and now he has utterly ruined his country and himself. I look upon him as the greatest criminal known, for having plunged the world into this ghastly war which has lasted over 4 years and 3 months with all its misery. This photograph of the ex-Kaiser and his entourage was taken at a railway station on the Dutch border as he fled Germany. November the 11th was to be his first day of exile in Holland, where he would live comfortably on his investments until his death in 1941. But on the 11th, he wrote a letter to his wife. My reign is ended. I have been rewarded only with betrayal and ingratitude. At the front, people were still dying. At 1 minute past 11, a British officer commanding a 6-inch howitzer battery was killed. His second-in-command ordered the entire battery to go on firing into the silent German lines for another hour. At 11:15, Captain Adrian Keth Faulkner recorded that it had been found necessary to end the days of a Hun machine gunner who would keep on shooting. The armistice was in force, but there was no alternative. Perhaps his watch was wrong, but he was probably the last German killed in the war, a most unlucky individual. At his headquarters train, Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, the British Commander-in-Chief, was entertaining the Prince of Wales. Haig had at last beaten the German army, but he was already worrying about how the victors were going to treat the defeated. A few days earlier, he had written in a letter to his wife, "I am afraid the Allied statesmen mean to exact humiliating terms from Germany. I think this is a mistake, because it is merely laying up troubles for the future."
He thought that the handing over of all the military transport was going to cause terrible suffering to the German people who would have to be fed, or German people east of the Rhine. He also, looking ahead, felt that the terms which Foch was going to, in fact did want, would make the German people in the future want to have revenge. He was not for very, very punitive terms, but simply to get the war out of the way and then make the best of things for Europe as a whole. And he was really worrying about the whole European problem. And I think that was his concern. I think he personally had no ill feelings against the Germans. He'd spent a bit of his life studying in Germany, and he had one or two contacts with German officers. You know, they had these interchange before the war, staff rides and things like that. So he knew the German general staff very well. So it was, you know, they're blood brothers in a way.
On November the 11th, 1918, vengeance was very much in the mind of a German corporal, recovering in a Polish military hospital after being blinded in a British gas attack. The corporal was Adolf Hitler. The armistice appalled him. He would later claim that the shock of defeat had made him go blind again. What was all the pain in my eyes now compared with this misery? What now followed were terrible days and even worse nights. I became aware of my destiny. I resolved to go into politics. Hitler was to tell his supporters that the German army had not been defeated, it had been betrayed. It cannot be that 2 million Germans should have fallen in vain. No, we do not pardon. We demand vengeance. In June 1940, Hitler would conquer France and insist on a return to the same spot in the forest of Compiègne, to the same railway carriage in which the 1918 armistice had been signed. This time, Field Marshal Keitel would dictate the terms of the French surrender. It was on November the 11th, 1918, in this same coach, that there began the Calvary of the German people. Every element of dishonor, moral humiliation, and material human suffering that can be imposed upon a people had its origin there. Hitler's new war would kill 50 million and leave a legacy of hatred and division that would wreck lives until the end of the 20th century. By midday, men had climbed out of their rifle pits and ditches and were shaking hands, sharing souvenirs and cigarettes. In some places, men got drunk together. All this was in defiance of the official order banning fraternization, and by mid-afternoon, an Allied picket was posted between the lines along most of the front. Refugees were already going back to their fields and farms, and there were some who doubted whether the land could ever be worked again. In towns and villages along the front, it seemed to many that the world could never be put back together. Winston Churchill would suggest that the ruins of Ypres should be left as a monument to what had happened. In Britain, the landscape and architecture were unchanged. There was no outward sign of a war having taken place, but as if in some terrible plague, so many men had disappeared. On this first day of peace, the newspapers listed another 4,500 casualties. Inside almost every house, in every village and every town, there was a grieving family. At noon in Shrewsbury, while the armistice bells rang out, a telegram from the War Office was delivered to 69 Monkmoor Road, home of Mr. and Mrs. Owen. Their son, the war poet Wilfred Owen, had been killed by machine gun fire a few days earlier. The last thing Owen wrote was a letter home from a cellar in Flanders. Dearest Mother, it's a great life. I'm more oblivious than, alas, yourself, of the ghastly glimmering of the guns outside and the hollow crashing of the shells. There's no danger down here, or if any, it will be well over before you read these lines. I hope you're as warm as I am, as serene in your room as I am here. Of this I'm certain, you could not be visited by a band of friends half so fine as surround me here. Ever, Wilfred. All over Britain on Armistice Day, people were learning the worst when they had every reason to suppose they had been spared. At Didbrooke in Gloucestershire, on the Earl of Weems' estate, it was the turn of the forester and his family.
My mother had this telegram to say that my brother had been killed on active service. And then, of course, that totally altered the situation then, you see. We were all very, very upset about it, including my poor old mother. He went out to look after some his comrades, carry these wounded comrades in. He carried the one in, all right, and he goes back the second time, and he got the other one, but he got wounded then, at the second attempt, when he went and fetched the other wounded chap in. Well, then the officer of the division pleaded for him to go back out because it was too dangerous. And he was very badly wounded then, but he wouldn't take any notice. He would go back in and try to get this third. And as he was bringing the third one back in, a sniper had him straight through the throat. That was Edgar, that's right, yes. He's won the Victoria Cross.
The Holmes family worked for Mary, Countess of Weems, at Stanway House, a mile away. On November the 11th, Stanway was in mourning for two dead sons. Ivo, the youngest, who had gone straight from Eton to be machine-gunned in Belgium, and Ego, who had been blown to pieces in Egypt. In her diary, their mother grieved for them even as she welcomed the end of the war.
This is the greatest victory. It is also the saddest peace. No one can feel light of heart. And for most of us, almost the hardest part is now beginning. We miss our shining victors in the hour of victory. The death of my father and my uncle Ivar was profound. It was a way exaggerated because the third son, Uncle Guy, was rather unsatisfactory. He was a very sweet man, but he wasn't very effective. And so the whole best of the family had gone. And the result of this was terrible. particularly to my grandmother and to my mother. I remember we used to sit in Stanway Church on Sundays, and I used to sit next to Mama, and she always broke into tears when we were praying for those who were dead, you know, and I found it very embarrassing, actually. My grandmother was a very courageous woman, and she decided that she was going to make the best of life without her two darling sons, and indeed she succeeded in doing so. One of the objects upon which she focused her energy was my brother David and myself, because we were hope for the future. So she was very sweet to us and loved us very much.
She was grateful that Ego had had children that she could continue to love, but she was very, very sad that Ivo was gone. I think Ivo was her favourite in some ways. He was very sort of sensitive and bright and poetic and charming, and I think she probably loved him more than any of her other children, and felt particularly sad at his death. And she took to spiritualism. Quite a lot of mothers of people killed in the Great War did, and tried to sort of get in touch with him and with Ego, but particularly with Ivo. She felt he probably was trying to get in touch with her.
Soon after the war was over, families set off on sad pilgrimages to the battlefields to look for the graves of fallen relatives and to ask for news of the missing. In 1919, Lady Frances Horner, a friend of Mary Weems, went to France with a copy of the recently published Michelin Guide to the Battlefields. The country was still almost the same as it had been in the war, wrote Lady Horner in her diary. Villages disappeared, and only a signpost pointing to them as if they still existed. The trees all black sticks holding up their lifeless limbs. Not a green tree left. And duckboards along the fields and trenches marked with German names. It was a very grim sight. Lady Horner had lost her only son, Edward, and her son-in-law, Raymond Asquith, the Prime Minister's son. She found their graves marked by temporary wooden crosses, which many years later she hung in the village church at Mells in Somerset, next to the bronze monument she commissioned for her dead son. Early in the war, it had been decided that no family, rich or poor, would be allowed to bring home the body of a loved one. Lady Horner had also tried to find news of Charlie King, a young man from the village missing in action.
Poor Charlie, he was only 21, and he was only out there about 6 weeks when he was lost. We don't really know what happened to him because he was reported missing. Lady Horner, she was very kind to my mother then. She did made inquiries around hospitals and things to see if he was in hospital anywhere, but she did on one occasion thought she'd found him in a hospital in Boulogne, but it wasn't him. They were very upset, especially my poor mother. I remember, well, some years afterwards, perhaps we'd be sitting of a winter evening, and I've heard her say, more or less to herself, you knew what she was thinking. I wonder what happened to that poor boy. You knew that she was talking about Charlie, you see, because she never knew what happened to him. Wonder if he crawled away and died by himself or something, you know.
More than 1 million British and Empire soldiers died in the Great War. Half the dead over 500,000 bodies, would never be found, or if found, not identified. Such was the nature of modern warfare and high explosives. Men simply disappeared. The Great War had been fought backwards and forwards over rich farming land. In his 1918 report to the War Graves Commission, Sir Frederick Kenyon drew attention to the long-term problems of battlefield clearance. A very important question is that of the single scattered burials. Over all the battlefields, bodies have been buried where they fell and have not been moved since. This is particularly noticeable in the Somme area, where thousands of burials have been found. The time will come when this area will be given back to cultivation, and then every argument will be in favor of the removal of the bodies. As it is now, the plough cannot touch it, and to plough over these thousands of bodies would be an unspeakably revolting task. From as early as 1916, there had loomed the awesome question of what to do with the dead once the war was over. Fabian Ware, the head of the Imperial War Graves Commission, later calculated that if the Empire dead marched four abreast down Whitehall, it would take them 3.5 days to pass the cenotaph. These were the glorious dead, whose epitaphs would be composed by the most famous writer of the British Empire, Rudyard Kipling. On November the 11th, 1918, Kipling and his wife Carrie were at Bateman's, their home in Burwash, Sussex. When the wind blew in the right direction, the Kiplings could hear the thunder of the guns in France, but not today. They had been waiting for news of the armistice, but there was no telephone, and the Kiplings would not realize that the war had ended until next day, when the Burwash church bells began ringing for the first time in years. The Kiplings were still trying to come to terms with what had happened to their only son. John Kipling had been rejected by the army because of poor eyesight, but his father pulled strings to arrange a commission in the Irish Guards. A few months later, he was gone, missing at the Battle of Loos. He was only 18. Kipling was devastated. He wrote a bitter poem called The Children. That flesh we had nursed from the first in all cleanness was given, to be blanched or gay painted by fumes, to be cindered by fires, to be senselessly tossed and retossed in stale mutilation from crater to crater. For this we shall take expiation. But who shall return us our children? Even during the war, Kipling and his wife had been to the front, visiting hospitals in France and Belgium, hoping for news of John. By November 1918, after a 3-year search, they had to accept that he was dead and that his body might never be found. A soldier of the Great War, known unto God. This was one of the epitaphs Kipling would compose for the British war dead. The dead would lie in cemeteries designed by the Empire's finest architects, with trees, shrubs and flowers laid out to recall an English country garden. The temporary wooden crosses of battlefield burial would be replaced with permanent headstones recording name, age, rank, regiment, date and place of death. No moss or lichen would be allowed to blemish them in the years to come. These cemeteries, more than 1,000 of them, are the silent cities of the dead, to be tended in perpetuity, originally by men who had themselves served in the war. One of the soldiers who became a war graves gardener was a medical orderly called Walter Sutherland of the 3rd Canadian Casualty Clearing Station. On the morning of the 11th of November 1918, Sutherland was caring for the wounded at a field hospital near Ypres, where some of the biggest battles had been fought. When the war was over, the hospital site became the 2nd largest of the war cemeteries. Sutherland married his Belgian sweetheart. His son George and grandson Alex both followed in his footsteps as gardeners at the same cemetery.
When they brought them from the front, from the fighting front, the hundreds of cartloads of wounded and dead were brought here over the cobblestones, horse and cart, and the blood was dripping out, you know, from the wounded soldiers. And then they brought them into the hospital. That's where my father had his job to select them and take some of them in hospital and some of them in the mortuary. My father took a dead person into the mortuary and he heard a groan. And he looked and there was chap still alive. And they took him out and back in the hospital and they saved him. He wanted to forget, but he couldn't. Those who were still alive after the war, especially my father, they thought they had a duty to perform and take care of them graves.
Out of the shared hardship and horror of life and death in the trenches, there had grown a strong sense of equality and an erosion of the class barriers and divisions men had brought with them to the war. Fabian Ware and the War Graves Commissioners were determined to reflect this new democratic spirit in the design of the cemeteries, despite bitter opposition at home. It was felt that the provision of monuments could not be left to individual initiative. In the large majority of cases, either no monument would be erected or it would be poor in quality, and the total result would be one of inequality, haphazard and disorder. The monuments of the more well-to-do would overshadow those of their poorer comrades, and the whole sense of comradeship and of common service would be lost. It is necessary to face the fact that this decision has given pain in some quarters. Not a few relatives have been looking forward to placing a memorial of their own choosing over the graves which mean so much to them. Yet it is to be hoped that even these will realize that they are asked to join in an action of even higher significance. Equality for the dead was to be echoed by greater equality for the living. By 1918, all British men over 21 and women over 30 would be allowed to vote. At 3 p.m. on the 11th of November, Lloyd George would tell the House of Commons, "Thus, at 11 o'clock this morning, came to an end the cruelest and most terrible war that has ever scourged mankind. I hope we may say that thus, this fateful morning, came an end to all wars." Now came the challenge of peace. Lloyd George had promised that the soldiers would come home to a land fit for heroes to live in. In the centre of Glasgow, George Square was packed on Armistice Day. In the crowd was a left-wing activist called Emmanuel Shinwell. Shinwell had grown up in poverty in the Glasgow tenements and had spent the war years looking after the interests of Clydeside dockers and merchant seamen. Now, Shinwell could see huge economic and social problems looming when the demobilized soldiers came home.
They'd survived a war in which many, many millions had died. And they came back, and the promise of the government was that this was going to be a land fit for heroes, a land that they would want to live in when they came back. And they came back and they discovered it was the same poverty, it was the same hardship that they had left before. Many of the traditional heavy industries which existed in Glasgow, such as the shipbuilding industry, heavy engineering, the mines, that had been crucial elements of the war effort, they were no longer needed. These heroes came back from the First World War to discover they were effectively on the scrap heap. Nobody wanted them. There were no jobs for them. There was no future, just the continuing poverty and hardship of before. Many of the women who worked in munitions factories during the First World War found themselves out of work.
Those lucky enough to be employed were working the 60-hour week of wartime production. Shinwell and other labour leaders wanted this reduced to 40 hours to create 50% more jobs. 3 months after the armistice, Shinwell was back in George Square at the head of a mass demonstration of 20,000 strikers and unemployed ex-soldiers. Fighting broke out, and the Riot Act was read.
Well, it wasn't very long after the Russian Revolution, and there was a kind of revolutionary atmosphere, very common among the workers, because they thought if you could depose the Tsar and destroy the Tsarist regime, then we could deal with capitalism in the United Kingdom.
Events in Russia had made the government afraid of Bolshevik revolution in Britain, and the authorities panicked. 12,000 troops were brought into Glasgow with barbed wire and machine guns. For the first and only time in Britain, tanks were on the streets.
The powers that be, the government of the day, they were effectively scared of what this strike might lead to. And that, in many respects, is why there was the problems in George Square, why there were the injuries, why there were tanks and policemen on the street of Glasgow.
3 of the strike ringleaders were sent to jail, Shinwell for 5 months. But out of the events of George Square came trade union power and the rise of the Labour Party as a real political force in Britain. "60 years on, Manny Shinwell, now Lord Shinwell, would write that he was grievously disappointed by Britain's slow progress towards the world he hoped to see. I had visions in my early days of a different form of society, where there was no impoverishment, where the slums had disappeared, where the people behaved better, and where there was no vandalism or juvenile delinquency. I had all these ideas, and my colleagues and I were very disappointed. By November 1918, the British aristocracy must have sensed that the old order of power and privilege could never recover from what had happened. 6 months after the armistice, Mary Weems would go down to the cricket ground at Stanway to watch the first game of the season. The first game, in fact, since the war began. This time her son Ego would not be there to captain the Stanway team. It was a sorry sight during the long years of the war to see the grass grow thick and ragged and the dandelions flourish in the cricket field, where silence reigned instead of shouts and laughter. But the day came when the grass was mown, some old players returned to the field, some new boys joined, and cricket began again. I steeled myself and went to see them play. And Last, the head keeper and cricketer, said to me afterwards with deep feeling, "Oh, I missed seeing that brown head and those long, swift legs that swallowed up the ground, and the quiet, strong voice that kept everyone in his place, and the patience, kindliness, and tact that considered everyone's feelings."
The First World War had one terrible effect, is that it killed a great number of the natural leaders of the country. They simply were wiped out, and they weren't there anymore. And the result is that power drifted away from the hands of the land-owning aristocracy into somewhere different. It had to happen. It's all right. But don't let anybody pretend it's not a revolution. It is.
As far as my great-grandparents were concerned, they no longer felt themselves at the centre of politics. I mean, my great-grandmother, Mary Weems, her lover had been the Prime Minister, and he was First Sea Lord at the time of Jutland, and he was Foreign Secretary at the end of the war. She felt very much at the centre of things. After 1918, it became politically a new landscape in which they felt less and less able to influence. So I think there was a feeling that they'd lost out in terms of being involved in the centre of politics anymore.
My grandmother entertained a lot, and she was quite political and entertaining. I mean, she was a great friend of Arthur Balfour, and he used to come here regularly, almost every weekend. James Barry used to come, lots of them. And those weekends when they were all there were very important, and they made even important to Britain because things were discussed there. You know? We've had, and very good they've been too, socialist governments. Well, you couldn't have had that before the war, I don't think. And so there it is.
Why couldn't there have been a socialist government before the First World War?
Well, because I think the country was really ruled by the aristocracy very largely, and they wouldn't have liked it too much.
We haven't had an MP in the family since before the First World War. No, I mean, so the process of separating off the old governing class from the process of governing has continued apace.
Does that matter, do you think?
Does that matter? Yes, I think it does matter, but it's a fact.
Why does it matter?
Why does it matter to not be involved in politics? Because you can't influence what's going to happen to you. We still have a cricket team, but only one of its members lives in Stanway, the others all live in Cheltenham nowadays. But in those days, all the people in the cricket 11 were from Stanway, and that was a terrific sort of social glue, as it were, this joint love of cricket which affected everybody. Everybody around here, from the top to the bottom, took the war very seriously and sacrificed a lot to try and win it. They felt they were fighting for civilization, and they felt that the whole way of life, the whole British way of life, was at stake, and that this was a battle you couldn't dodge. There is a point of view that it was all a ghastly mistake, and that we shouldn't have got involved in the First World War. And there's a point of view that the actual outcome was so disastrous for us that whatever had happened if we'd stood aside couldn't have been as bad. It's a romantic idea, that, in my opinion. If you had allowed, if we hadn't joined in, the Germans would have won. There's absolutely no two ways about that. The reason it seems quite such a waste of time in retrospect is because it led to the Bolshevik revolution in Russia. We'd created this monster of Russian communism, which led to the most appalling political developments in Russia. I mean, the cruelty and violence and political unpleasantness on a scale nobody'd ever dreamt possible, with sort of mass exterminations of whole classes of people, and incredible suffering and waste and casualties and inefficiency. You couldn't say you'd preserved civilization if by fighting the war you'd created that.
In Trafalgar Square, on the evening of November the 11th, a huge bonfire was lit against Nelson's column.
They had some German guns there in Trafalgar Square, and they set light to them, all blazing away, and this big red hot spark shot out in amongst the crowd. Everybody was joyful and cheerful, and where they found the beer they was there to drink it.
The armistice celebrations would go on for 3 more days and nights, growing ever more violent until the police cleared the streets. At the front, on the night of November the 11th, soldiers on both sides disobeyed orders and lit up the night sky with a huge display of signal lights, flares and explosions. It's 80 years since the end of the Great War. Soon there will be no one left alive who was there. Meanwhile, from time to time, the dead insist on being remembered. The remains of another 27 soldiers were discovered recently in a field in Flanders. Fragments of uniform identified 3 as Royal Fusiliers. 2 could be identified by name from their metal identity tags. They had been killed in the Battle of Arras in April 1917, and in March of this year, they were reburied with full military honors.
The legacy of the Great War, remembering that it was a war which people thought was going to end all wars, was a determination never to have another. I think young men now are more cynical and critical, and this is partly the legacy of the First World War. People are much better informed than they were. In the First World War, you didn't have radio. Second World War, you had radio, so people could listen to the radio, knew what was going on around them. Now, of course, you've got television and radio, and so people are much better informed, and they're able, therefore, to judge for themselves what they think of a particular situation, and not so ready to be told by someone else this is actually what's happening. I don't think people would fight in the same way, nor would they unquestioningly go forward to be killed in large numbers as they did then. I don't think you could get people to do it. Though the test, of course, is it national survival? In a situation where this country is put at risk and it was either die or end up as a slave or be carted off to a death camp, then I think a lot of people would volunteer and a lot of people would fight very hard indeed.